name is Renata Weinstein, and we're in Ellenville. It's 7 o'clock on 11/13/93. And would you state your name?
My name is Ruth Savoca.
And where were you born?
In Berlin, Germany.
In what year?
1929.
What were your parents' names?
Arthur and Marie.
Could you hold one second?
The full name? Yeah.
I'm sorry, the earrings are probably gonna bother
they're
us.
lighting up because...
Well, they're a distraction.
Yeah, okay.
That'd be
Sorry.
Great. Thank you.
Tell their last name.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Okay, ready. Go ahead.
Don't be nervous at all.
No,
okay?
no.
Okay. Just be comfortable.
Yes.
You know,
Mhm.
this is for you.
Yes.
What was your parents' last name?
Mayerovitz.
How long had they lived in Berlin?
Well, they were there all of my time, which was 10 years, but it was prior to that because I had a brother who was 11 years older, and I have a sister 9 years older. So I would imagine they probably got married in Berlin, and that was their home.
What did your parents do for a living?
My father was a tool and die maker, and actually, during the part while my existence, that I could recall during my existence there, he had rather a difficult time with jobs, and so we also acted like, I guess you would say, maintenance people of the building, like janitors. I guess you would say that.
What?
Where you would keep a furnace, you know, and
When you say your father,
keep it clean.
your father had difficulty with the job.
Yes, through being through his background of being Jewish, I would assume that's what it was, that he had difficulty finding work in his particular area. So when he was out of work, that's what he would do to supplement his income.
And what did your mother do?
She basically helped in doing that, in upkeeping it was an apartment house, you know, that we lived in. We got an apartment free to live in order to take care of the building.
You talked about sisters and brothers. Can you
Yes.
state the names and ages?
My brother's name was Kurt, and he was, he was born, if he was born 11 years before me, 1929, so he was
Say around
1919?
1938, you know, he was around.
No, 1918 he was born.
1918.
1918, okay.
Yeah, and my sister was born 1920, wasn't she?
Mm.
And her name is Irma.
Did anybody else live with you? With your family?
No.
Did any relatives live nearby?
Yes, my father had a brother not too far away, and there were others, because he was one of a large family. So there were other sisters and brothers that were nearby. And my mother had her father not too far away, but he had been married a second time, and there wasn't a big closeness there, I don't think. And she had cousins who lived outside of Berlin. But that's what, we weren't really a big family unit.
Was your immediate family close?
Yes, yes.
What did you consider yourself religiously? Was your family religious?
Well, my mother was Catholic, and so we sort of didn't have a very religious background. I don't know whether it was due to that or whether it was just the way it worked out, you know. When it came to holiday times, we did observe some things like Hanukkah, I guess the happy times more, and well, we had a special kind of mirror. It was almost shaped like a Christmas tree. So my mother would put just some dress-up ornaments on it at Christmas time. But we didn't have a lot of money, so gifts were not a big issue, and I guess celebrating wasn't available, really, you know, to do too much. But that didn't mean that we weren't happy. You know what I mean? In those years, you didn't have to have very much. You know, I had a doll and a most beautiful carriage. I've never seen them over here that way, and I was very happy with that, and I didn't look for anything else. And the other things I liked were helping my mother. I liked to really follow her around, I guess. If she dusted, she'd give me something to dust with, and if she baked, she'd let me help her bake and things like that, you know. So my brother and sister, being so much older, they weren't too thrilled about me when I arrived, I understand, because they much preferred a dog. And I was sort of a burden, I guess. They had to do some babysitting sometimes, you know. So, and they being so much older, it felt to me more like being an only child.
Were you closer with your mother than the older children, just because?
No, I don't really think so. You know, I think only as far as my being so much younger, you know, that I just needed more attention than they did. At the point that I'm, you know, remembering better, you know, from 8 or 9. I mean, before then, there's no impression in my mind about it, you know.
Well, what was your town like that you moved to?
Berlin, that was the, I think they called it Moabit area, and it was near, not far from Unter den Linden, so there was always lots going on. And it was a very nice section, and we had a wonderful zoo, and it was a nice place to live until things started happening, you know.
Were your parents' friends Jewish or not Jewish, or was it a mixed?
Well, there was some mixture, but I would say that maybe my father knew a few people that, you know, were Jewish, but I think that most of the friends that came visiting, that were friends of my sister and my brother, were not Jewish. And in fact, they had, in these buildings, they had very large storage areas, and my sister and brother had made one of them into a room so that they could have dancing there with a gramophone and have little parties, you know, and because I remember sneaking down there sometimes to see what was going on, you know, and nobody was looking and I could get away. So I think, you know, there were some good times, and then there were some horror times that came along.
Did you go to a Jewish school, or?
I did the last year because then it was not permitted.
But from the beginning?
From the beginning I went to a public school, yes. I think you started at age 5 and until I was 9, and then I went to the Jewish school that was close to my home. I could walk, I remember that. And I stayed there until until I went on the transport.
I just want to go back a little.
Yes.
Your mother was Christian.
Right.
Except for the Christmas,
Yes.
she put on the. Was there any other part of her religion that she
No,
instilled in you or
no,
brought?
no. I didn't go to church. I think that we did go to a synagogue once or twice for certain occasions, but she never took us to a church. You know, I never remember her doing that.
What grade were you in before you left for the kinder transport around?
You know, I don't know how grades went in Germany.
Okay, how old were you?
10.
Okay.
10.
And after you went to the Jewish school,
Yes.
were you still friendly with people that?
Well, I really mainly had one child that I played with, and her father owned a restaurant in the building. It was like a part of the building that we lived in, and so I was very close to her, and that didn't seem to make any difference, you know, because she used to invite me because they had an ice making machine, and she used to invite me to come because it was one that you manipulated by hand, and she knew that I liked to do it, you know, as well as her, and we also used to like to taste the ice cream because in Germany they made wonderful ice cream because they used fresh fruits, so it was a treat, you know. So I do not remember her parents saying that I couldn't come anymore. But it was maybe a little different because it was a restaurant, so you went through the building, and maybe because no one else was aware of it, you know.
And she lived in that.
Yes, yes. She lived in the building, apparently, so, you know, it wasn't a matter of walking somewhere.
Did you remember when things began to change?
Oh,
In your
yes.
town?
Well, yes. I mean, I remember Kristallnacht, which everyone who lived in Berlin, I don't even know if it happened any other place, but, I mean, I remember them breaking up the stores and starting the fires, and I remember I watched them taking people away in trucks, the men that lived in the area. So I did see all of that, and certainly there was always a lot going on since I was near Unter den Linden, and that's where most of the speeches occurred because that's where their headquarters were. So I used to see Goebbels and Goering. I saw the Italian Mussolini when he came for a pact, I guess. And yes, I saw, well, of course, once things got that bad, then my parents tried not to let me out, or they couldn't go out that much themselves. They didn't really bother my mother, as far as I know, but of course, my brother had, at the end, during the latter part of '38, he escaped to Holland. And my father tried to do the same after he successfully got into Holland, but he was not as successful, so he had to spend a night, I guess, being held by the police at the border, but they didn't detain him to send him away to a camp. So he returned home, and then he was all right until after I left.
Let's go back a little bit.
Yes.
Can you tell us what you remember personally the night of Kristallnacht in terms of
Well,
where
I
you
wasn't
were?
out that night, okay? I just know that the next day, I mean, I know that they set fires. I mean, they didn't only really do it that night because, I mean, I remember seeing fires, so it certainly couldn't have been that night. I don't think we would have gone out anywhere, but I remember that the next day we saw so much of the window panes that were smashed. and they weren't cleaned up right away because they did it to such a great area, you know. So that's really, you know, that I can see that, but I can't tell you if it exactly if it was that day. I'm assuming it had to be after, you know, before it was cleaned up. That perhaps my mother took me to school or something like that.
So right after Kristallnacht was around the time that you were now sent to the Jewish school.
No, oh yes, I was already. I think that was maybe that's when it happened, right around that time. Yes, because that was 38, and I left either in the end of July or beginning of August 1939 on the transport. So I would say that I probably was already in the school.
Did you have a sense of fear when walking on the streets in Berlin and being, you know, having to have changed schools?
Yes, because you saw so many uniformed men, and especially I think the SS with their black uniforms were frightening, you know, to a child, and they all looked so big anyway. When you're small, and they were mean. I mean, you know that if people didn't salute them and they caught you, I mean, they didn't hesitate about beating that person. So they were frightening. I certainly I remember being frightened. Yes.
Do you know how your parents heard of the Kindertransport?
You know, it's something I never asked them, but the way I got onto it, actually, of course, had to be because I had an aunt who lived in London. She went there. She probably went there around the time, if not before, that I was born, and she had a knitting business there, and she happened to have had 8 children herself, but the uncle that I had, who was not too far away from me, had one son, and he was she got him over first, and then I think that's how it came about. I guess that my parents asked if she would take myself and my sister as well. My sister, of course, didn't have to go on a transport; she could travel by herself because she was 19, which is what happened. My aunt wasn't too crazy about it, doing it, because she had done it for another sister, who then, on her way, met a man, a Belgian, and she never turned up in England. and unfortunately, because of it, she died, because she stayed in Belgium, and when that country was occupied, she lost her life there. So, but when I left, my sister left a little before me because she went to Holland to be with my brother for 2 weeks before coming on to England.
Okay, so how long after, when exactly did you?
It had to be the end of July or the beginning of August of 1939 that I left.
And do you remember discussing with your parents?
No, it seemed, the way it seemed to me anyway, was that, you know, one morning I got up and they had put my possessions together and told me that they were taking me to the train station to go to my aunt in England. And that's really, I can't even remember any feelings of something coming up, something impending, you know, because I guess I would think that my mother would not have wanted to tell me anything about it beforehand, because she would have known how I would have felt, since I always hung on to her skirts. So I think that she just left it to the last moment to tell me, so that I wouldn't probably be more, that it wouldn't be more traumatic than it was, you know.
Did you bring anything special along?
Well, I couldn't bring the carriage, which I loved, and I had a beautiful doll's house that one of my father's friends had made for me out of cigar boxes. That was really unique, you know. So I knew I couldn't. There was no way of anything like that. But I could take my doll. But for some reason, I guess the Germans took that away on the train. So I didn't have that even, you know.
Okay, so you got to did your parents take you to the train station?
To the train station, yes. They didn't travel with me any farther than that. They just, you know, I still remember, I don't know if you've been to Europe, you've seen the high gates that they close after a train is ready to leave, and that's what I remember, is being on the train and looking out and seeing them behind those gates, you know.
What would that feel like?
Well, to me, I think it felt probably like that I was desolate. And I just couldn't imagine, you know, where I was going or what there would be. You know, that's all that I can remember about it. I don't even remember very much about the trip, you know, like I remember them taking that and the earrings for my ears, because they had pierced ears. But I don't remember very much about talking to other children or anything like that. I know I went from the train to after we stopped at Holland, onto the boat. But I don't even remember who met me at the other end in England. It's a complete blank.
Do you remember specifically what happened on the train when they took away?
It was just that they, as well as having people who were in charge of the children, I imagine, you know, Jewish people who they allowed to watch over us to a certain extent, they had the SS and the SA men patrolling up and down, and maybe they had a child who they thought that your possession would be welcomed. So that's the only thing I could think of, you know. I don't know if they did that as a general rule, or I only remember that that it happened to me.
So at this point, your sister was already in...
No, she was still in Holland. She arrived in England after me.
Oh, okay.
So I came to my aunt's, and my cousin, the boy, was there, who's 4 years older than I was, who was my father's brother's child. And we were very close, even though there was 4 years difference between us. We always used to sneak up to the roof when he came, and I guess talk between ourselves, you know. And once we had little tiny, they called them lady cigarettes. They were like, you know, an outsized match that you would light a candle with, that's in a glass, you know. He brought that once, and he said we had to try it, you know. So we did things like that, even though, you know, I was really much too young for any of that. But so I was very. He was like an anchor, you know, when I got there, and he was protective. So accepting that, of course, we stayed together a very short time, because he was going on to an agricultural school that my aunt felt might be good for him to, you know, to go to. So he went, I don't know where he went, but wherever it was a farming area, you know. And I went to school in the East End of London, but maybe 2 days, 3 days afterwards, it was evacuated. And I went to live in Sussex, Haywards Heath, Sussex. And of course it was, again, just foster homes. And since I couldn't at that point speak any English, there there were people that felt uncomfortable with it, I guess. And so I moved about 4 or 5 times before I finally settled in with an older woman, and I liked it. She was in charge of a cricket team, like making the teas, for the cricket team, and I liked that. We would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and make little English sandwiches,
So after you stayed with
my aunt.
Your aunt for a while.
Yes, just a short while, maybe a week or so.
And your cousin, you didn't speak English.
No.
But your cousin.
Well, I don't think he knew much. Well, maybe he may have learned a little, because in Germany you had to learn, after 10 you would have had to take up 2 languages. That was a prerequisite. As that was part of the curriculum of the schools, I guess. So if he chose a language, he may very well have had some understanding of it, because I know he took me to the movies to see Jesse James movie. I always remember that too, and he must have explained it to me. So he must have understood something of the language,
So while you were at your aunt for that short period of time, had
Yes.
you heard from your parents at all?
Yes, they wrote. And in fact, I continued to hear from them while the American Red Cross, once the war started, the American Red Cross used to exchange letters between us.
So at that point you left your aunt and your...
And moved to Sussex
Right.
with the school.
Right,
Yes.
okay. And after that point, what happened?
Then I went to the school that I was evacuated with, and as I say, I had one teacher who there were no other German children evacuated from the school, so I was the only one who spoke German, and she helped teach me English by pointing to items, and she gave me the English word and I would give her the German, and that's how we exchanged things, and that's how I learned to speak the language. I guess children at 10 it must be much easier, to pick up another language, because it only took 3 months. And I could speak it. I don't know that I could understand everything as far as the book learning, But they understood that, I guess, and worked along with me,
And at this point, your sister had arrived already?
Yes, but you see, she was 19, so she was considered an enemy alien. So she, at first, they had thought that they would intern her, but she went to live with cousins of mine who had a clothing store, and she herself had been taught to. Well, she was a dressmaker, so this is what they did in the store. They sold ready-made things as well as making clothing for people to order. And so she stayed with them, and since that was in the East End of London, she could only travel a radius of 8 miles, and I was 20 miles away. So she couldn't come to see me. But when I finally moved in with this one woman that was my last home there while going to school, she used to take me into London occasionally to see my sister, even though at that time the bombing had started. But she took me anyway, and that was the only contact other than writing, that I had with my sister. But then when I was 14, I had gone to be taught shorthand and typing in the evenings or in late afternoons after school. And my sister had paid for that for me. And at 14, she wanted me to stay at school, and I said no. I wanted to work, and I got a job with a lawyer. Nothing fancy. It was sort of like a clerk, I guess. And I did that for a year.
You were 14?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And and then I felt that I didn't want to stay there any longer. That, you see I guess at 10, if you leave your home and you're completely on your own, as I was, you grow up and you become an adult. You're not a child anymore. So I went to school because I had to, but when I felt it was time, then I thought I would like to work in London, and so I told my sister that's what I wanted to do. And the war was still on, and it was to the point where the lightning bombs had started. Those are the rockets and the buzz bombs. Those two things were just starting at that point. But she said, okay, if I wanted to come, I could. The problem was, where was I going to live? Where she lived, there wasn't space, So she did find a family for me to live with, but they had 3 daughters already. So sleeping was not a problem, but 5 people to get up in the morning and me becoming a 6th to get ready to go to work. Bathrooms were not like here, You didn't have a bathroom for guests and things like that. So I was there a little while, but it got to be difficult. And then I had another aunt, other than the one who brought me over. We were not close. I don't know, who knows why, But she had 2 sons and a daughter. But the 2 sons were grown. And the daughter was a little younger than myself, So I was probably 14 and a half or whatever, going on 15. And so I tried living there. But that didn't work out either. So I wanted to live in a room by myself. But she said I was too young to do that, my sister. So she said, well, she would look around, and she found the hostel, Casanoff Road. So she said that if I wanted to stay in London, that I would have to go there.
At this point, was your sister, what was with your parents?
Well, at that point, we were not getting anything from the Red Cross anymore because, the bombing was really pretty severe. My father had jumped off a truck on his way to Auschwitz, and he was living underground. And my mother, they didn't bother her, so I imagined that she was working at something in order to keep herself alive, and through friends, I think, and then.
You didn't know this at that point. That your
Yes,
father jumped off.
Well, it must have been in the letters. Well, no, it couldn't have been because they wouldn't have. The Germans edited that, so I don't know. You wonder sometimes. You lose the sequence of things. Maybe I only learned about it afterwards. Probably that's what it is. But yet I knew that my brother was. I knew he was in a concentration camp once Holland was invaded.
Because he had gone. After Kristallnacht, he had gone into hiding, or he had.
Well, yes, towards the end of '38, he had gone into Holland, and Holland, being a small country, was invaded by slews of refugees. I mean, it wasn't only Jewish people who were leaving; it was priests and people that perhaps had deformities of some kind, which Hitler didn't allow. There were all manner of people, probably political people who didn't have the same views as Hitler. So what they did was they formed a camp, and it was an internment camp, and they put these people to work so that they would not be a burden on them, because, as I say, Holland is a very small country. So that's what he did. He worked within this camp, and in fact, he met a girl whom he married and had a child with, but they both ended up, in regular concentration camps. We know that my brother died in, was it Belsen? Belsen, right? But they separated. They thought they would stand a better chance, so she went to Auschwitz, but we could never find out the end result. There were never any records of her or the baby. But we, in another segment of this kind of this life, Sharon found out. Sharon, my niece, found out as much as she could through the Red Cross, and put together, I think, very interesting material, which she's turned over to the museum, the Holocaust people, so that it can be entered, and because there are a couple of things that are sort of not easy to find, and some people don't even want to part with some of these things because whatever reason they have themselves, for holding on to this memorabilia, or the only thread that's left, So anyway, that's so I went to work in London in the West End for RKO Radio Pictures while the war was still on, and lived in the hostel, and for 1 year. And then I met a girl in there, in the hostel, from Czechoslovakia, and she and I were sort of kindred spirits, and she had left the hostel before me and found a room in a boarding house, or whatever you call it, and she was after me to take a room there too, and that's what I did. My sister then allowed it, I still wasn't probably more than 16, but she allowed me to do that, And then of course, the war came to an end, and we started searching for my parents. And took a little time because my father did live underground, but though he had many terrible experiences, he came out of it, and then he had to find my mother. And then the Russians walked in to Berlin and were probably equally as cruel as the Germans. And so they left to go to Munich. And that's why we had a hard time finding them, because we couldn't hook it up.
Did go back to Berlin, and he did get you
find my mother, yes. But that we learned, then once we found them and started writing, and that's how we learned that story. And then my sister started, proceedings to get them to America. But that was later on because she met a GI and came over here as a GI sweetheart.
When you were with your sister,
yes,
towards that end time when she let you come to London,
yes,
was she kind of taking over the role of a parent?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sure. She supplied me with clothing, and I was working, so I was able to pay for the room myself, and I was able to buy whatever food I needed. There wasn't much around anyway, but living with that friend of mine, we were able to share our coupons, and then I had made friends, and they would invite me for dinner sometimes, so, but rationing was of an entirely different nature than people who talk about it here in America. We had very little, as the war progressed. So, but sometimes, as I say, you could go to restaurants. I don't know what you found, but but you could. There were naturally restaurants.
So during that time when the war began, it was tough in terms of eating and.
Oh yes, yeah. There were lots of things you couldn't. Certainly, we liked it very much when we found that Canadians and Americans came and we could barter for pantyhose, or stockings. I guess they weren't pantyhose in those years. I guess they were stockings, but nylons. So I don't know. We were wearing pretty ugly things like made out of lisle, cotton. That was a cotton. So yeah, and that's pretty much my story, I guess.
Well, can I ask you a couple more questions?
Sure.
Okay. So when the war ended,
Right.
and your sister began searching for your
Yes.
parents.
Right.
And at the same time, was she searching for Kurt separately, or?
No, because we had already known. We had already learned that he died, so there was no need to search. But I don't know. See, there had to be a way that we heard that through the Red Cross too, though, because I remember being still an evacuee at school when we learned of that, because he died in 1944, right? It was late into the war that he died, and maybe letters were coming through very very seldom, but still coming from my mother, because that it had to be from her that we heard, because the Germans had told her that he died. I think they had said of pneumonia in a hospital, and that they had done all they could, which was of course not true, but that was one of the documents that the museum was interested in. The telegram from the German government. So that's how we learned, and I'm sure that until maybe very very much towards the end of the war, that perhaps the Red Cross just couldn't manage it anymore, and maybe with so many other things going on that letters were not always their first priority.
I also heard that it was dangerous.
Of course, yes, because these had to be people too who had to smuggle this stuff out for, because the Germans certainly weren't going to allow anyone to write letters and inform anyone of all the things that were happening, in fact, So I guess, you have to understand that, first of all, if I'm 64, this is going back a long time, and it's not something that you think about a lot, because it was so very painful, a lot of it, and yet there were lots of things. I remember having a good time too. There were they used to call them tea dances, and I used to go to them, and in the afternoons, they had turned Covent Garden into a dance hall, and it would be something like in New York, what's the name of that dance hall?
Rosalie.
That's it. Yeah, something like that it would be, and it was a lot of fun, that's when the jitterbug was big, and a nice kind of dancing, the close dancing. So, you could, in England they had wonderful concerts. You could go to the opera, you could see ballet, even though it was limited, but you could, during the war you could do some of that, and then after the war, of course, I was there until 1948.
That's what I wanted to ask you. So
yeah.
Your parents got back together in Berlin.
Yeah, but we didn't. It was it took us quite a long time to find them. And we didn't do anything really concrete until my sister came over to America. She came over in 1947 in June, and she got married in July of 47, and then she first arranged for me to come. And then when I came over in 48, then my brother-in-law started to prepare the papers. Then I guess we knew by that time. Maybe it wasn't even 48, maybe it was 49, because my parents didn't come until 1950. But they were not very healthy, you know, and they stayed with my sister for maybe, I don't know if it was even a year, and my father found a job as, I don't know, maybe you call it machinist, and certainly in the area that he knew, you know, tools, die making, that kind of thing. And they moved, they bought a little house in
So when you
Huntington.
You all ended up in New York.
Well, by that time, 1950, I was working in New York, and I was living in New York. I was living in the Bronx, and I was working on Wall Street.
And you were how old?
Then I was 18.
18.
19. I came over, I was 18 that year, but when they came, I was already, by the time they came, I was nearly 21. So I didn't see them for 11 years, you know, and it was rather strange. You knew they were your parents, but something during those years was lost. You can make up 10 to 21. It isn't that you don't love them, because of course you don't stop doing that, but there's not the same responses in you to, you know, first of all, my father was very disappointed. He expected me to be a lawyer. And I said, how did he expect me to become that? It wasn't so easy, you know. Their organizations weren't going to keep on helping you, and I didn't feel it was right that was up to my sister. She wasn't my mother, and she wasn't my father. She may have been willing to do it, but I was not. You know, of course, later I was very sorry that I didn't listen to her and continue on, because, as you know, education is probably one of the most important things in your life, you know. But it was okay, you know. I became a legal secretary, and it was okay.
So you were working then in New York. Did you get married soon?
I got married the year that they came over, in 1951. They came over sort of the beginning, I guess, or maybe they came the end of 50, and I got married in 51.
Does your husband...
No, he died 10 years ago, nearly 11, and I married a man who was of Italian descent. And even though my father had married my mother, he wasn't happy that I married someone who was not Jewish.
So your first husband was Jewish?
Yeah, my only husband. I never had another one. He was not Jewish.
Oh, he wasn't Jewish. Okay.
No, he was Catholic. And but as things worked out, they grew to. My mother, of course, didn't have. She was not. She didn't care. You know what I mean? What I married. I think she was just probably thankful to be together. You know, but my father got over that, and everything worked out okay. You know.
Did your father live close to you at this
Well, he lived in Huntington, which was closer really to my sister, because she lived in Bayshore, Huntington Station. He lived in it. But my mother wanted very much. She came from Bavaria, and she loved the mountains, and she very much wanted to go back into that kind of an environment. And I guess the closest they came to it was they moved upstate to Worcester, New York. And because my father had suffered heart attacks and strokes and couldn't work anymore. And so even though after the last stroke, which had left him paralyzed on one side, he was a very determinate person, and he was able to walk again, not as before and not talk as before, but everything was okay, because he could talk English. My mother never did really learn English, you know. And they lived there, and they were, that was okay. They liked it there, and it was just farther for us to go visit them, you know. It was quite a trip, back and forth, you know, especially then when my mother got ill herself with a heart attack. And although she came out of the hospital, unfortunately, they weren't close to a hospital there, and her lungs filled up with water and she died. And that was in, what year was that, Sean?
63 or 64?
No,
63.
63 maybe. And then my father had a stroke a year exactly to the day that my mother died, and went into a coma and died a few days later. So I think 63 my mother died, and 64 my father died.
Do you have any children?
No. No, I don't have any children.
What was that?
Just didn't happen, you know?
Didn't happen.
Yes, just one of those unexplainable things,
Right.
I guess, you know?
Do you consider yourself a survivor?
Yes, very much so. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that, you know, it's probably made me strong enough to stand what I had to, all the different illnesses that I had to contend with, and it wasn't easy for the year before my mother died. It was just real, not even a year before my mother-in-law died. So it was 3 people dying in 2 years, and you have to be pretty strong to contend with all of that. And then my husband also was sort of ill on and off, and then became really ill with cancer, and that was tough. So, you know, you have to be tough to get through all that, because you almost have choices. You could let yourself go, you know what I mean? So you have to be, I think, strong to decide that, you know, if you went through all that, there must be something worthwhile to stay alive for, you know? And it's okay.
Did you ever discuss with your father after he came
His
back?
experiences?
His experiences?
Oh, yes. He needed to talk about it. I mean, he had to live out of garbage cans, and he became. Are you having enough? He became quite ill once, with terrible boils under his arms, and he had to go into a hospital to have them lanced. And he was lucky that they didn't give him away. And another time he got a piece of fish with a bone in it, and if he didn't go to the hospital then, he also would have choked to death. So, you know, he had pretty nasty experiences during that time of living underground, and I guess he, on top of it, he had to wonder how were his children, you know. He didn't know about my brother probably because my mother and he couldn't meet because it would have been much too dangerous. But it was on account of Christian people that, you know, he survived, because somebody had to help him every now and then and give him some food and shelter besides what he could find, you know. As time went on, there wasn't much left in garbage cans, you know, because the Germans didn't have much to eat anymore either. So...
Did you discuss with him your story and what had happened to you?
Yes, he wanted to know about everything, and I guess there wasn't much to say. It wasn't his fault. What happened, you know, he and my mother sent us away so that we would be safe, you know. And I guess he just hoped that we would do as well as we could without them.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you so much.
You have a tough job there.
Let me just take a photograph of you for
Oh.
our files. Okay?
Oh.